In 1959, 7-year-old Frankie Harrow vanished without a trace from a bustling amusement park. Decades later, a rusted locker pulled from a riverbed uncovers a secret buried for generations and a trail of hidden lives, silent guilt, and a town's forgotten darkness. The summer of 1959 in Fairhaven, Ohio, was the kind that settled into memories like a sunbeam through a dusty window, hazy golden warm with promise. Children dashed barefoot through sprinklers, neighbors left pies cooling on window ledges, and the clinking music of the carousel at Fairhaven Fun Park carried on the breeze from sunup until long after dark. 7-year-old Frankie Harrow was the kind of boy who lived in motion. Wiry and tow-headed with a smile just shy of a dare and knees perpetually scraped. He moved through the world like he didn't trust it to stay interesting unless he ran fast enough to catch it mid-change. That Saturday, July 18, 1959, he clutched a red ticket booklet in his fist and dashed ahead of his parents into the park, not knowing it would be the last time anyone would see him. The park was packed. Cotton candy spun blue clouds above sticky hands, and the air was thick with popcorn and the mechanical groans of rides in motion. Frankie's mother, Ruth, adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and called after him more out of habit than alarm. "Franklin Harrow, stay where we can see you." But Frankie had already vanished into the carousel queue, chasing the calliope's jangle. Ruth turned to her husband, Carl, who rolled his eyes and grumbled about letting boys be boys. But even he smiled a little as he sipped from a sweating bottle of knee-high grape soda. Parents lost sight of kids in crowds all the time, especially at Fun Park. It had been a Fairhaven staple for 20 years, run down in parts, but still full of magic. Nobody ever imagined danger among the teacups and corn dogs. Frankie's last known location was the carousel riding a black wooden stallion near the outer ring. A photographer captured the moment for a local paper doing a human interest piece. In the black and white image published days later, Frankie's arms are raised in joy, head tilted back in mid-laugh as the horse lurches upward. The ride ended, and according to the operator's statement, the boy dismounted, waved at someone unseen, and walked toward the games row. Then nothing. An hour later, Ruth noticed his absence. The kind of noticing that prickles under the skin before the mind catches up. The kind that starts with annoyance, sharpens to concern, and by the time she ran to the security booth near the bumper, cars bloomed into blind terror. The search started quickly. Employees fanned out. Names were shouted over loudspeakers. Visitors watched with polite concern. Then the Fairhaven police arrived. By nightfall, the park had emptied out the blinking lights reflected in rows of idle hot dog carts and overturned soda cups. A search dog tracked his scent to the south end of the park, toward the water, but then lost it near the base of a chain-link fence. The riverbank beyond the fence was cluttered with brush trash and an old maintenance road no longer in use. But no footprints, no clothing, no signs of struggle. Just the Ohio River glinting darkly, tugging whatever secrets it held downstream. By Sunday morning, the headline was, "Boy Missing from Fairhaven Fun Park. Search Continues." Local volunteers combed the surrounding woods. Divers were called in from Cincinnati. The FBI made inquiries. Tips flooded in, none credible. By Monday, the tone of the town shifted. Hopeful posters gave way to whispered speculations. Strangers were side-eyed. Teenagers boasted false sightings for attention. And Ruth Harrow sat on a folding chair beside the carousel, gripping her son's photo and refusing to go home. Detectives found no ransom note, no evidence of abduction, no confirmed sightings. His belongings remained untouched. His father's Oldsmobile was parked right where they'd left it. A child doesn't vanish into thin air, the lead detective had said. But somehow Frankie Harrow had. 2 weeks later, the search was scaled down. The Harrow home, once filled with Frankies shouting and toy trucks ricocheting off the walls, was now marked by a silence so thick it felt physical. The room was left untouched. His shoes sat neatly at the edge of the bed. A paper airplane he'd made from a comic strip was still mid-glide on the windowsill. Ruth clung to ritual lighting a candle in the window each night. Carl buried himself in work at the auto shop, shoulders hunched with quiet rage. The town offered casseroles and condolences, and eventually fewer and fewer stopped by. The seasons turned. Posters faded. Leads evaporated. By the end of the year, the police file was labeled inactive, not closed, never closed, but cold. Frankie became legend. Mothers invoked his name as a cautionary tale. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the closed sections of the park at night. Frankie's watching, they'd whisper, laughing with unease, but no one really believed he'd be found, until 63 years later, when a rusted padlocked locker was dredged up from the Ohio River 5 miles downstream during a volunteer cleanup event. Inside, buried in silt and time, was a single child's shoe, and someone was finally ready to talk. The house on Willow Lane had long since stopped pretending to be a home. The white paint had peeled away in broad strips. The flower beds Ruth once tended were now overrun with creeping weeds, and the curtains stayed drawn tight year-round. Carl Harrow had passed in 1981, heart failure, the official record said. But neighbors whispered it was really a slow corrosion of the soul that began the day Frankie vanished. Ruth remained. She had outlived the hope, the search, and the silence. She spent her days in the parlor, surrounded by old photographs and newspaper clippings, the candle in the window still burning every evening without fail. Over the years, people had gently suggested she let go. Friends, pastors, a psychologist once. She only ever nodded and returned to her place by the window. The town changed around her. The fun park finally closed in 1989, citing poor maintenance and declining attendance. The lot stood empty for years, a monument to memories people weren't sure they wanted. Then the developers came, razed most of it, and put up a strip mall on one side and a medical center on the other. But the southern fringe, where the old tunnel of whispers and maintenance sheds once stood, remained untouched. The land was unstable, prone to sinkage near the riverbank, and thus unsellable. Nature had started reclaiming it. In 1994, Ruth gave a rare interview to a local newspaper for a 35-year retrospective on unsolved disappearances. She spoke little. What she did say haunted readers. I still make breakfast for 3. After that, she withdrew completely. Mail piled up. A Meals on Wheels volunteer was the only regular visitor, and even she only stayed long enough to drop food off on the porch. When she died in 2018, the obituary was brief. Her remaining relatives, nieces, and distant cousins sold the house within 6 months. Frankie's room remained untouched, save for the smell of age and dust. Back in 1959, the Harrows were the picture of suburban stability. Carl owned a garage, and Ruth worked part-time at the library. They weren't flashy, weren't involved in town politics, didn't throw parties. But they were loved, perhaps even envied for how tightly knit they seemed. Frankie was their only child, born after a string of miscarriages. He was their miracle, their everything. His disappearance shattered them in ways that went beyond grief. Carl, once the life of the garage with a dirty joke and quick grin, grew harsh and paranoid. He once accused an employee without cause of knowing something about Frankie's fate and fired him on the spot. Ruth, meanwhile, built shrines. Not overtly, she wasn't the type to hang crosses or light incense, but quietly, methodically. The drawings he left behind were laminated and preserved. Each birthday she bought a gift, wrapped it in gold paper, and stored it in the closet. For years she wrote letters to the Fairhaven Police Department, demanding updates, begging for answers, offering to pay for private investigators. But each time the answer was the same: no new leads, no witnesses, nothing to indicate whether he'd been abducted, drowned, or run away. Not that she believed any of those. By the mid-1960s, the whispers began. Some blamed a drifter. There had been a rash of petty thefts in the area around the same time. Others speculated about a carnival worker with a sketchy past. One tabloid even suggested Ruth herself was involved in accusation that led Carl to punch a reporter in the jaw. But the truth was there was no truth, not then, and so the Harrow family faded into Fairhaven's background. Ruth stopped going to church. Carl rarely left the garage. On what would have been Frankie's 18th birthday, a yellow ribbon was tied around the maple in their front yard. That night, someone tore it down. Nobody ever confessed, and nobody had to. It was the town's way of saying, let it go. When Carl died, Ruth didn't even hold a service, just buried him quietly, no flowers. Only Frankie's old stuffed dog placed in the casket with his father. A final promise. For 60 years, Ruth never moved from that house. She refused to. People offered. Officials tried to cite her for code violations. She ignored them all. She wasn't waiting, she insisted. She was keeping. It was in her will that Frankie's room remain undisturbed after her death. That no one should box up his belongings or repaint the walls. She left no explanation, only the line he might still come home. That strange devotion became a local curiosity, a footnote in town history. High schoolers dared one another to peek into the windows of the Harrow house at night. Urban legends sprang up around Ruth, that she spoke to ghosts, that she'd gone mad, and kept a room filled with children's clothing, that she had seen Frankie once, all grown up, watching her from the tree line. But none of it mattered to her. Only the candle in the window, and the untouched room, and the breakfasts for 3. Then 4 years after her passing, the Ohio River receded, after a dry summer exposing a stretch of shoreline, long hidden beneath thick brush and tangled reeds. Volunteers with a conservation nonprofit planned a cleanup along the old bank. They found car tires, rusted toys, even the twisted remains of a wrought iron bench likely swept away during a storm decades earlier. And then, near a bend in the river where the current slowed and the mud ran deep, someone spotted the sharp corner of a metal box jutting from the earth. It was heavy, coated in slime and rust, but the engraved numbers on the front were still legible barely. 117. Fairhaven hadn't had this much excitement in years. The locker, number 117, a standard-issue metal type from mid-century schools and parks, was hauled onto dry land by 3 volunteers and a deputy sheriff who'd joined the cleanup effort. It took an angle grinder to slice through the rusted padlock, and by the time the door creaked open with a groan, half the town was buzzing with curiosity. Inside, buried beneath layers of mud and time, were objects that made the sheriff step back and whistle low. First the shoe, a child's leather Oxford size 1, still intact, though stained and warped by years underwater. Then a crumpled Polaroid, grainy and sun-bleached beyond recognition, but faint outlines showed what might have been a boy on a carousel. Finally, a small plush duck, its once yellow body now mottled brown, the fabric stiff with age. One wing was torn, and dark blotches speckled its belly. Tests later confirmed it was blood type O, matching Frankie's medical records. The scene was immediately sealed. The locker was transported to the county lab. Word spread like wildfire. By the following morning, the Fairhaven Ledger ran the headline. Locker pulled from River Mayhold, clue in 63-year-old disappearance. People who had long since forgotten Frankie Harrow, or had never heard of him, suddenly spoke his name again. Online forums sprang up. Old-timers dug out yellowed newspaper clippings and school yearbooks. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion that it was planted, that it was meaningless, that maybe this finally meant something. The police department issued a statement urging calm. The current sheriff, Joel Anders, was a cautious man, unaccustomed to media frenzies. He hadn't even been born when Frankie disappeared, But the name was familiar. It was part of the town's DNA. In a press briefing, he said, "It's too early to speculate. We've reopened the case, yes, but we can't make assumptions. We're following every lead, every piece of evidence, and we've asked for state support." But the timing of the locker's discovery wasn't the only strange thing. An anonymous envelope had arrived at the sheriff's office the same day. It contained only a page torn from an old Fairhaven Fun Park brochure dated 1959. Across it, in jagged, faded handwriting, were the words, "Look deeper than the ride. No return address, no fingerprints, no explanation." Sheriff Anders was a practical man. He didn't like mysteries, and he certainly didn't believe in ghosts or coincidences. But this had teeth. He sent the evidence to the state lab for advanced forensics and called in a criminal psychologist to review the letter. Meanwhile, he tracked down anyone still alive who had worked at the park in 1959. Only a few names surfaced: 2 ride operators, a janitor, and the old manager Jasper "Jazz" Howley, now living in a retirement home in Dayton. Jazz was nearly 90, half deaf, and sharper than he looked. He remembered Frankie, remembered the search, but what stuck out most to him was something odd from the week before the boy vanished. There was a man, Jazz said, squinting toward the window. Didn't work for us, but he was there every day that week. Brown cap, dark sunglasses, always watching from the edge. I thought he was security, or someone's dad. But he never spoke to no one. And then Jazz said something that made the air in the room still. He was standing by locker 117 that last afternoon, just leaning against it, like he was waiting. It was enough to raise hairs. Anders returned to Fairhaven and had the area surrounding the locker's discovery site researched. More debris turned up, but nothing concrete. Divers scanned the riverbed using sonar, but most of what they found were rusted pipes, fallen branches, and history drowned in mud. Still, the sense of something watching, something surfacing, wouldn't let go. The reopened case dredged up old wounds and older stories. Townsfolk who'd lived through that summer began speaking up things they'd held back out of fear, shame, or simple forgetfulness. A retired nurse recalled seeing Ruth Harrow in the ER 2 days after Frankie vanished. Her arm bandaged, though no injury had been reported. An old cop, now bedridden, claimed someone had paid him off to ignore a tip about the boy near the shed. All speculation, no proof. The town, meanwhile, slipped into a strange duality, half stuck in nostalgia, the other half teetering on paranoia. Some residents wanted the case buried again. Others demanded justice answers closure. But most of all, everyone seemed to feel that something had broken loose. And they weren't wrong. On a humid Thursday morning, the coroner called Sheriff Anders. "You're going to want to see this," he said. Inside, the plush duck from the locker beneath the stuffing forensic technicians had found something unexpected, a rusted charm necklace tangled in the toy's inner seams. The name etched on it had barely survived, but under ultraviolet light it was clear: Frankie. It wasn't a smoking gun. It didn't explain how it got there or what it meant. But it was enough to turn the case from rumor to fact. Enough to convince Anders that someone somewhere still knew more than they were saying. The problem was time erases traces. Buildings are torn down, people die, memories fade. But someone had placed that locker in the river. Someone who had waited decades to be found. And someone who perhaps was still alive. Detective Mira Ellison was 72 when she got the call. Technically retired. Technically uninterested in cold cases. But she hadn't missed a Fairhaven headline in nearly 2 decades, not since she'd moved to Columbus to be closer to her grandkids. When the article about the river locker hit the state wire, she nearly spilled her morning coffee reading the name. Frankie Harrow. Mira had only been a rookie in the Fairhaven PD when the case went cold. She hadn't worked the file directly. No one trusted a 22-year-old woman to do more than filing and coffee runs back then, but she'd obsessed over it. Kept clippings in a private folder. Interviewed retirees off the books. In her 30 years of service, she'd solved 16 disappearances, 3 serial cases, and 2 undercover corruption rings. But Frankie was the one that never let go. When she called Sheriff Anders the next day, her voice was sharp, no nonsense. "You need me on this," she said. Before he could ask why she'd reached out, Anders hesitated. "We've got people. You've got rookies and analysts," she cut in. "But none of them know this town the way I do. I remember the park. I remember the feel of that summer. You're chasing shadows, Sheriff. Let me help you see where they used to be." He agreed. Not out of desperation, but because deep down he sensed that she was right. There was something about the case that resisted modern logic, something that required old instincts. Mira arrived in Fairhaven that weekend trenchcoat, and all despite the 85-degree heat. She was leaner than she'd once been, slower in her gait, but her mind was sharp as ever. The first thing she did was visit the evidence room and lay eyes on the locker. She ran a hand over its ridged metal and closed her eyes. It was inside the park fence back then, she said. Southwest quadrant. Near the Tunnel of Whispers, close to the back maintenance sheds. Anders nodded. That area wasn't mapped out well. Barely anything left of it now. Mira smirked. It was barely mapped even then. The sheds were unofficial. Storage for old ride props. Broken parts. No public access. She flipped open her notebook. Let's start with this: who had keys to those sheds in July 1959? Anders had already dug up some of the old employee rosters, now scanned into brittle PDFs. Mira scanned the names: ride operators, concession staff, maintenance crew. One name jumped out: Gene Arliss, maintenance assistant. Hired June 1959. Quit August 2nd. Short employment. No listed address. No contact info after 59. Mira raised an eyebrow. "Ever hear of him?" she asked. Anders shook his head. "None of the old-timers we've interviewed remembered him. That's not unusual. Kids came and went every summer. Some just passed through." "Yeah," Mira said, "but this one left right after the kid vanished." She ran a background check. Nothing. No driver's license. No property. A few old tax records under the same name in West Virginia during the 1960s, then a gap. Mira ordered a deeper search through genealogy sites and old employment registries. In the meantime, she went to the Harrow house. New owners, now a young couple from Cleveland, who had no idea they'd bought a Legends address. They let her look around. Frankie's room had been painted over, modernized, but the closet still had the faint scent of lavender from Ruth's old sachets. Mira stood silently imagining the boy's last morning, eating eggs, tying his sneakers, laughing at a cartoon, before piling into the family Oldsmobile. Later that day, she visited the remnants of Fairhaven Fun Park. The medical center stood gleaming where the carousel once spun. The strip mall was bustling with coffee shops and boutiques, but the southern fringe, now a wild tangle of trees and overgrowth, remained undisturbed. A rusted sign still jutted from the brush. Tunnel of Whispers, closed for repairs. Mira hiked the overgrown path to the spot. She could see faint outlines of what used to be concrete steps, now broken and buried under ivy. A shallow depression hinted where the ride's foundation might have been. And beyond that, she found what looked like the entrance to a service hatch, covered in debris but unmistakably artificial. She called Anders. "There's more under here," she said. "Much more than the park ever reported." That night, Anders called in a survey crew. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a subterranean space roughly 20 feet by 15 beneath the southern end of the ride. Not listed on any of the park's blueprints. Mira stood over the scan printouts in the sheriff's office and tapped the outline. "That's not a maintenance area," she said. "That's a room. Someone built this intentionally." Anders leaned over. Could it be where the locker was taken from? Mira nodded slowly. Or where it was used. They scheduled an excavation for the following Monday, but Mira couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the Polaroid. Something about it nagged her, the angle, the framing. It didn't look like a candid tourist shot. It looked composed, as if someone had stood back deliberately, knowing it would be the last image of a child. And then there was the duck. Children carried toys. It was normal. But to cut it open, hide a necklace inside, then stitch it shut, that took intention. Someone had wanted to preserve a piece of the boy, a message, or a trophy. Look deeper than the ride, she muttered to herself. She closed her notebook, stared at the ceiling, and whispered what she already suspected. This wasn't random. The room beneath the old tunnel of whispers had no business existing. When excavation began that Monday, the team expected a shallow service crawl space. What they uncovered instead was a fully enclosed chamber, poured concrete walls, sealed with thick layers of tar-like waterproofing. A steel door lay twisted from age and pressure, half buried in soil. It had no hinges, no window, no knob on the inside. From within, there had been no escape. Mira, Ellison stood at the edge of the dig arms, crossed the summer sun, high and merciless above. Sheriff Anders approached beside her, holding a damp cloth to his neck. "Looks like a fallout shelter," he said. She shook her head. Fallout shelters don't get built without records, and not underneath an amusement park attraction with no entrance above. They sent in a drone, first cheap, efficient. The footage revealed peeling walls, remnants of old wooden crates, rusted pipe fittings, and a length of thick rope curled in the far corner. In the center of the room lay something that stopped them cold, a metal ring bolted to the floor with a length of broken chain still attached. Once safe, the forensics team entered. The air was musty sharp with mildew and rust. Every surface bore the stain of time and secrecy. Tucked near the corner, just behind one of the crates, they found what Mira had been dreading: bones. Tiny, scattered, but not human. The coroner later identified them as animal remains, rabbits, birds, and possibly a raccoon. All long dead. All with similar trauma patterns, blunt force injuries, some with signs of restraint. This was a test site, Mira said quietly, before someone moved on to people. In the far crate, they uncovered fragments of old clothing, shreds of gingham, part of a child's sock. Tucked in the sock was a matchbook. The print was still legible: Eagle's Roost Motel, Gallipolis, OH. A handwritten date in blue ink, July 25, 1959. "That's a week after Frankie vanished," Anders said. "Think someone took him there." "Maybe," Mira replied, staring at the sock. "Or maybe whoever kept this left it behind, as a promise." The discovery sparked media frenzy. News vans parked along the highway leading to Fairhaven. Reporters with sharp suits and canned sympathy stood in front of the rusted sign reading "Tunnel of Whispers," speaking about secrets and silence. Online forums surged again. Reddit sleuths spun wild theories. Some thought a satanic cult had used the space, others blamed federal cover-ups or links to MKUltra. The truth, as always, was grittier and more mundane. Someone had built a hiding place. A place where things and people could be kept without question. Mira had the matchbook bagged and logged, then drove out to Gallipolis herself. The Eagle's Roost had long since changed hands. The building was now a halfway house, its neon sign cracked and dark. Still, the woman managing the desk agreed to let her see old records. Down in the musty basement, Mira sorted through water-stained ledgers and handwritten logs. And there, under July 25, 1959, she found a name. E. Arliss, room 16, paid in cash, stayed 3 nights. That name again. Jean Arliss, the maintenance worker who vanished after Frankie's disappearance. Mira called Anders immediately. "Run everything you've got on Arliss again. Cross-state aliases, fake SSNs, P.O. box rentals. I want a web, not a line." Back in Fairhaven, Anders had also received a second envelope. No return address, no postmark. just left in the drop box outside the station. Inside was a photograph, black and white, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed a boy in striped shorts and a polo shirt sitting on a bench next to a payphone. In the background, the Eagle's Roost Motel sign clear as day. A note was scrawled in red ink across the bottom. "You forgot to check the phone." Mira arrived back in town just after sunset. She met Anders in the station's evidence room. The photo was pinned to a board beside the old Polaroid from the park and a faded copy of the 1959 employee roster. Threads connected each item in red string Frankie to Arliss, to the motel, back to the locker. "I've seen that phone," Mira muttered. "It's still out front of the motel next to the Coke machine." "Let's go," Anders said. They arrived just after 9 p.m. The payphone miraculously was still bolted to its post, though the receiver was missing and the metal corroded. Mira crouched beside it, running her hand under the ledge. She felt something a notch. Then her fingers brushed cool metal. Taped beneath the phone's shelf, encased in a rusted Altoids tin, was a folded sheet of paper wrapped in wax cloth. Inside, a letter. "To whoever finds this, I was never supposed to be part of it. I just fixed things. Repaired the Ferris wheel, tightened the bolts on the swings. But they knew I had debts. They said I could pay it off if I helped with just one job. Said the kid wouldn't be hurt. Said it was a mistake that got out of hand. But I saw the room. I heard the screams. I saw the photos. I didn't kill him, but I didn't save him either. Locker 1 to 17 was mine. I thought if I kept a piece of him, maybe someone would figure it out. Maybe someone would come looking. I'm sorry for everything. G.A." Mira stood silently as Anders reread the letter. "G.A.," he said. "Jean Arliss. Confession." "Not quite," she said. "It's guilt. Regret. But it's also misdirection." "How so?" She turned to him, eyes sharp again. "Because it doesn't say who they were." For the next 3 days, Detective Mira Ellison barely left the sheriff's office. The letter had confirmed what she'd long suspected. Frankie Harrow hadn't just vanished. He'd been taken. And someone, likely more than one person, had gone to great lengths to ensure the boy's disappearance remained a mystery. Jean Arliss had left a trail, but a cautious one. Deliberate. Fragmented. Designed not to exonerate himself, but to make sure the truth would eventually surface. The problem was the mention of they. If Arliss wasn't acting alone, and Mira now believed he hadn't been, then someone else had been in control. Someone more powerful. Someone connected. She dove back into the 1959 Fairhaven Fun Park staff records. Scanned not just the names, but pay stubs, job assignments, even third-party contractors. One detail caught her eye. A payroll entry listed an external mechanic subcontractor, Midwest Spectacle Engineering, contracted that summer to install a new electrical system under the Tunnel of Whispers and adjacent dark rides. Mira ran the business through state archives. It had been dissolved in 1962, but not before its owner, a man named Royce Madsen, had been charged with tax fraud in Illinois. The case was settled, and Madsen disappeared from public record. No death certificate, no obituary, no gravesite. She requested a deeper search. Anders brought in a liaison from the State Bureau to expedite data retrieval. Mira had her own methods too: contacts in retirement homes, librarians who remembered stories, amateur archivists with sharp eyes and long memories. One of them came through. A former postal worker in Fairhaven, now 94, remembered delivering mail to a trailer that stood on the outer edge of the park in the late 50s. Said the man who lived there was strange, rarely spoke, but always tipped generously. Wore the same brown cap every day all summer. Had one of them lazy eyes, the old man said. Couldn't tell where he was looking, but you felt it. He didn't recall the name, just that the man smoked hand-rolled cigarettes and listened to jazz at night, the crackling kind that made you feel like something bad had just happened or was about to. Mira felt the pieces shift. A brown cap, a constant presence, a private space near the park. Unaffiliated, unnoticed. She called in an aerial survey from 1960, and a blurry image showed a small trailer tucked behind the park's south fence precisely where the terrain dipped toward the old sheds. It was long gone now, swept away in a 1973 flood, but for Mira the picture was enough. Someone had lived just outside the boundary of law and responsibility. Someone who might have orchestrated what Jean Arliss had merely enabled. But she needed proof, and then, as if summoned, it arrived. A state analyst called, with results from the DNA sample pulled from the plush, duck trace blood type. Oh yes, but more than that, mitochondrial DNA consistent with maternal relatives of Frankie Harrow. It was him. The duck hadn't just been a memento. It had been with him when he died. Mira requested the remains found in the underground chamber be re-examined with modern methods. Initial reports had classified them as animal, but the new lab team found fragments previously missed 3 phalanges, small, but unmistakably human, fused to a calcified shard of cloth. The wear patterns suggested trauma. Fast, violent. Likely blunt force. She held the report with steady hands. This was a kill site, she said. Anders grimaced. So Frankie died there. But why move the locker? Because guilt festers, Mira replied. Or maybe fear. Arliss likely couldn't bear keeping it close. The river was the final burial ground. And then came another development. The State Bureau's genealogist had found a possible match for Jean Arliss in records from 1984, an arrest in Kentucky, under the name George Arlen. The mugshot was old, faded, but the ears and nose were the same. The man had died in 1991 in a fire at a flophouse in Paducah. His body had been burned beyond identification, but the dental records matched. The trail had ended long before anyone thought to look, but not everything burned in that fire. An officer who'd been first on the scene had kept a journal. He'd written offhandedly about finding strange clippings on the wall, old newspaper stories about missing kids from Ohio and Pennsylvania. One article had been circled, Fairhaven Boy Still Missing, the Mystery of Frankie Harrow. So Arliss had held on to the memory. Not out of pride, not even self-preservation, out of penance. Still, Mira knew he hadn't acted alone. The final breakthrough came not from the forensics team, but from a dusty archive box. It was Anders's intern, Emily, who found it. She'd been cataloging old town records when she stumbled on a misplaced file from 1960 notes from a zoning dispute involving the southern edge of the Fun Park property. A neighbor had filed a complaint someone had been digging at night, pouring concrete near the riverbank. No permits. No noise curfew. The complaint had been dismissed by the town clerk at the time. And who was the clerk? Royce Madsen. Mira read the file slowly, jaw tight. Madsen hadn't just worked on the park. He'd used his position to bury it all literally and bureaucratically. A room constructed without oversight. A child vanished. A patsy left behind. And a river that held its breath for over 6 decades. She stood from the desk, heart pounding. Royce Madsen isn't dead, she said aloud. Anders turned. What? He disappeared, she said. There's no proof he ever died. No proof he didn't change his name, start over. After 60 years, Mira nodded. Guilt doesn't rot. It waits. She looked back at the wall of evidence, at the smiling boy on the carousel, at the letter, the duck, the faded photo. If he's out there, she said, he knows we're getting close. The man with the brown cap had no name, at least none anyone ever recalled clearly. But the stories, those had persisted. He'd been seen often at the park during the summer of '59, always alone, always observing, never buying tickets, never riding rides. Just there near the carousel or the tunnel of whispers, leaning against rails, his cap tugged low and sunglasses always on even at dusk. Back then, no one questioned a quiet man keeping to himself. It was a different time. Trust was given, freely suspicion kept to whispers. Mira and Anders compiled every eyewitness account they could find. One name came up again and again in those fragile, fading recollections: Mr. Denny. A vague, possibly false name. But a few old-timers were sure of it. He'd tell the kids his name was Denny, said Loretta Carver, now 79, who once ran the cotton candy booth near the game stalls. Said he used to work for a circus. Said he missed the smell of sawdust. No employee records listed a Denny. But that didn't stop Mira. She spent 2 days tracing the alias, diving into old incident reports and police files from nearby counties. And then, in an obscure 1963 theft report from a carnival in southern Indiana, she found something: a Mr. Dennis R. Maddox cited for unauthorized access to animal quarters and suspicious behavior near child rides. He had been briefly held, then released, when the traveling show moved on. But Mira focused on the signature. It matched the handwriting in the letter found under the motel payphone, which made no sense because that letter had been signed G.A. Gene Arliss. Unless he hadn't written it. Mira pulled the letter again, examined it under magnification. Slight tremor in the looped letter's inconsistent slant. Different than Arliss's original employee forms from 1959. She called the forensic handwriting analyst. Run a match against Dennis R. Maddox, she instructed, and check aliases for Royce Madsen. Same area, same years. The results came back the next morning. The letter was not penned by Arliss. The script matched documents filed under Royce Madsen in 1957 employment contracts and permit requests related to Fairhaven Fun Park's construction. More alarming, it also matched a 1983 check-in signature at a nursing home in Toledo under the name Robert Maddox. That's him, Mira said quietly. He faked Arliss's confession. He left the trail himself. Anders leaned over the table. Why fake a confession for a crime you committed? Mira thought for a long moment. Because the guilt caught up to him. Because no one came knocking for 60 years, and he thought he'd gotten away with it, but couldn't live with the silence. So he built a puzzle. One someone might solve after he was gone, except he's not gone. She nodded. Exactly. They found the nursing home easily. It was still operational, though, now a rehabilitation center under a new name. The staff was helpful. They located intake records for Robert Maddox, checked in 1983, left in 1985. No forwarding address. He paid in cash. No social security number on file. But one detail stood out under emergency contacts. A single name was listed. Delilah Madsen, daughter. Now they had something real. A living relative. She lived in Asheville, North Carolina. Age 54. Elementary school teacher, widowed, no criminal record. Mira booked a flight and took Anders with her. They arrived on a bright morning, the kind of day that made the mountains glow blue. Delilah Madsen was calm, composed, and cautious. Her face betrayed little until Mira laid out the story: the boy, the locker, the letter, the hidden room. I don't know anything about that, she said flatly. Mira nodded, unconvinced. You were born in 1971. Your father, Royce, disappeared the following year. No one ever found a grave. No insurance claims. No legal closure. He died, she said. Did he? Anders asked. Or did he become Robert Maddox for a while, live off the grid, cash only, no paper trail? Someone forged that letter. Someone who knew about the locker, the duck, the motel. Delilah's hands trembled slightly. I was 7, she whispered. We were always moving. Trailers, rental homes. He said it was work, but I heard things at night. Crying, screams, and once when I snuck into his study I found... She stopped. What did you find? Mira pressed gently. Delilah stared at the kitchen table, jaw clenched. A photo album. All black and white pictures. Kids. Boys. Always boys. Some of them were crying. Some looked asleep. I asked him who they were, and he slapped me so hard I fell over. The silence after that was long. He told me they were for study, she finally said. That he was keeping them safe from bad people. I didn't understand. But one picture I remember I never forgot. She stood, walked to a cabinet, and returned with a small cloth-bound album. The cover was dusty. Inside were a few faded photographs, family trips, birthdays, school shots, and in the back one image stuffed into a plastic sleeve. A black and white photo of a boy on a carousel, smiling, hands in the air. Frankie Harrow. Delilah began to cry. I didn't know his name, she said. But I always wondered. I never showed anyone. I thought maybe it was one of his students or... Mira placed a hand gently on hers. It was a kidnapped child. One your father took, and likely killed. Delilah collapsed into the chair. I thought he was just strange, she said. But he was evil, wasn't he? Mira didn't answer. She didn't have to. What mattered now was this. Royce Madsen hadn't died. He'd vanished again, but somewhere he might still be out there. Watching, waiting. They returned to Fairhaven in silence. Delilah Madsen's testimony paired with the photo was enough to reopen the case as an active homicide. Though the statute of limitations on many charges had expired, murder had no deadline. Mira knew that with modern forensics, they could push further. All they needed now was a location, a trace, a breath of where Royce Madsen had gone next. Anders arranged for a full forensic sweep of Delilah's childhood homes, starting with the earliest trailer parks she could recall. A state task force joined in, pouring through motel logs, land sales, and false identities, tied to Maddox Madsen or any permutation. But what finally moved the needle came from the past. An anonymous voicemail arrived on the sheriff's department tip line, muffled but distinct. A man's voice, raspy with age, offered 7 words before hanging up. The tunnel has more than one end. Anders played the message on repeat, brow furrowed. Mira stood slowly. He's taunting us, she said. Or warning us, Anders replied. The original Tunnel of Whispers had been excavated already. Its main chamber uncovered, its basement opened. But now Mira wondered, was there more? A second passage possibly leading away from the main chamber, long collapsed or buried. She called in a team with advanced radar equipment contractors who specialized in forgotten architecture and cave-ins. They returned to the southern edge of the park, where the tunnel's remains lay like a broken jawbone in the dirt. It took less than a day. Beneath the ride's southern curve, 30 feet beyond the known excavation, the radar pinged hollow space. A narrow crawl tunnel, 5 feet in diameter, led downward and eastward toward the river. A maintenance passage, perhaps, or an escape route never mapped, never registered. Digging took 3 more days. Every inch brought new tension. Roots twisted through broken concrete. Damp soil collapsed unpredictably, but eventually the crawl space gave way to another room smaller than the first. Roughly 10 by 10 feet, with a rusted folding chair, an empty tin ashtray, and a milk crate filled with VHS tapes. It had once been sealed tight. No moisture damage, no mold. A time capsule. The tapes were labeled with dates. Most were between 1980 and 1990. Some just had numbers, row 1, row 2, or row 3. The earliest one said 7 to 1859. Mira stood frozen, breath caught in her throat. That's the day Frankie disappeared. They brought the tapes to the lab. It took hours to find a working player. Each was transferred to digital and cataloged. The content was difficult. Most were recordings of TV news reports, missing person segments, surveillance camera dumps. But interspersed were home movies, recordings of playgrounds, fairs, birthday parties, all filmed from a distance, all of children. The tape labeled 7/18/59 began with footage of the Fairhaven Fun Park entrance. Grainy, shaky, but clearly handheld. Mira watched stunned as the camera zoomed toward the carousel. A child in striped shorts was climbing atop a black horse. Frankie. The camera lingered. The tape cut. A new scene appeared, locker 117, the number glinting under a sodium light. Then darkness. That was all. A court order was signed. That same day, the case was officially reopened as a homicide investigation, with Royce Madsen, aka Robert Maddox, possibly Dennis Maddox, named a suspect in the disappearance and probable murder of Frankie Harrow and possibly others. Mira's phone rang that night as she was leaving the station. A blocked number. She answered. "You're closer now," a man's voice rasped. She froze. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "You didn't look under the floor." The line went dead. Anders triangulated the call's origin to a nearby gas station. But the security footage was useless glare from the pump lights made faces indistinguishable. Whoever it was, they were watching. The next morning, Mira returned to the second room, the one with the tapes. She studied the floor. Cement poured roughly uneven. Hairline cracks spidered across one corner. She dropped to her knees and tapped with her knuckles. Hollow. They broke through it. Beneath was a box. Steel, locked. It took hours to cut open. Inside, plastic sleeves of documents, each wrapped meticulously in waxed cloth. Birth certificates, photographs, social security cards. At least 12 different identities, all tied to Royce Madsen. And at the very bottom, one final envelope, weathered but sealed. Inside, a photograph. Frankie Harrow. Not on the carousel, but sitting on a wooden bench in a dimly lit room, hands folded, eyes wide. Alive. Mira's chest tightened. The reverse of the photo had a message handwritten in faded ink. He wasn't the first, but he screamed the longest. She dropped into the nearest chair, fingers trembling. It wasn't just a killing. It was a campaign, a method, a ritual. Royce Madsen had orchestrated more than just one disappearance. He had stalked, studied, and documented for decades, and he had hidden in plain sight. She stared at the photo. "I swear to you," she whispered, "we will bring him into the light." Outside, the sun had risen, but underground Fairhaven's shadow stretched deeper than ever. They brought in the FBI the next day. What had begun as a local cold case now bordered on a serial predator investigation spanning decades. The box beneath the second tunnel room, filled with aliases and archival horrors, had become Exhibit A in a federal-level manhunt. But despite its shocking contents, it raised one deeply frustrating problem. Royce Madsen was still a ghost. Each identity in the steel box traced to a location, a period, even property titles. But the trails always ended abruptly. No signatures after a certain year, no death certificates, no confirmed relatives beyond Delilah, no social security activity past 1994. As if the man had orchestrated his own vanishing act time and again. And yet he was watching. The anonymous calls, the perfectly timed messages, the choice to leave a trail only when someone got close. He was out there, somewhere, and Mira knew it. She studied every photograph from the newly uncovered trove. Kids at county fairs, playgrounds, birthday parties. Most bore no identifiers, faces faded or captured from the back. But Mira made copies and worked with analysts to attempt facial reconstruction and pattern recognition. AI tools identified several children who'd been reported missing across the Midwest during the 1960s and 70s. In 4 cases, the dates on the photos were before the reported disappearances. He had stalked them. He had planned. In one photo, a shaky, zoomed-in shot of a 4th of July parade in Kentucky, Mira noticed a reflection in a shop window. Faint, blurred, but unmistakable, a man in a brown cap holding a camera. Mira enhanced the image, zooming again and again until it pixelated into near abstract forms. But she could see it. The posture. The shadowed eyes. He was there and he was filming. She turned to Anders. "We're done playing defense." He nodded. "What's your move?" "We lay bait." Anders raised an eyebrow. "He's not a fish." No, Mira said. He's a collector. He watches his legacy, which means he'll want to see how it ends. They made a plan, simple, risky. They would release a press statement, a fake one claiming they had positively identified a living witness from 1959 who had seen Royce Madsen abduct Frankie Harrow. That the witness was willing to testify. That they would reveal the individual's name and statement at a public press conference in 2 days. It was a trap. The conference would be staged. Security undercover. Cameras ready. A room full of law enforcement, all eyes trained on the entrance, and Mira would be there sitting in the front row alone playing the part of the alleged witness. The press release went live the next morning. By afternoon, the station received a single phone call. No words, just the recording of a carousel organ. Click. Line dead. He had heard them. The next 24 hours passed in a haze of preparation. Officers positioned themselves throughout the municipal auditorium. Checkpoints were arranged at every entrance. Surveillance drones were deployed above the surrounding streets. Mira waited heart-pounding behind calm eyes. The doors opened. Local press filtered in. Cameramen set up. Then a man appeared at the rear of the room. Old, thin, stooped slightly, brown cap in hand. He walked with a limp, eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He scanned the crowd, then focused on Mira, and he smiled. That smile was like ice on bare skin. Not because it was sinister, but because it was satisfied. Like a game had finally ended. Mira held his gaze. He took 3 more steps forward, then stopped. "Hello, Franklin," he said softly. Gasps echoed. A reporter stood too quickly, knocking over a tripod. Within seconds, officers swarmed. But the man didn't run, didn't speak. Just stood there, arms at his sides as if awaiting judgment. Royce Madsen was taken into custody without resistance. Fingerprint analysis confirmed his identity within hours. Dental records sealed it. He was 91 years old, and he confessed within the first interview. Not proudly, not emotionally. Just a matter-of-fact listing of names, dates, methods, as if reciting inventory. Frankie Harrow had been taken, he said, because his light was too bright. He saw everything. Mira asked him, "Why keep the photos?" "The locker. The duck." Royce Madsen blinked slowly. "You don't paint a masterpiece and throw away the brush. Why now?" she pressed. "Why let yourself be caught?" He smiled again. "Because someone finally came close enough to deserve it. There would be trials, DNA matches, property searches, reopened cases from 5 states, a timeline of horror stretching from 1953 to 1991. But for Fairhaven, for Ruth and Carl Harrow long gone, and for the boy who once laughed on a carousel horse, there was finally a name and a face and the terrible necessary truth. The trial of Royce Madsen began 7 months after his arrest. Due to his age and frailty, it was held in a specially adapted courtroom with medical staff on standby. But make no mistake, there was nothing fragile about the man on the stand. Not in spirit, not in mind. He pled guilty to the murder of Franklin Harrow and 6 others, naming them one by one, even when only vague identifiers remained. He described the construction of the underground chamber, the process of building trust with park employees like Gene Arliss, and the calculated way he chose his victims, children who were bright, confident, curious. He never showed remorse. "I was a curator," he said at one point. Their fear was the final note in a symphony of control. The courtroom was silent. Delilah Madsen testified under a victim protection clause. Her face remained partially concealed. Her voice trembled only once. She held up the photograph, the one she had hidden since childhood. The one of Frankie on the carousel. "I didn't know," she said softly, "but I knew something was wrong, and I was too scared to ask." It was her testimony that humanized the horror. Reminded the jury that evil didn't always arrive with a knife or a threat. Sometimes it wore a cardigan made oatmeal and kissed its daughter goodnight. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Royce Madsen was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Not that it would matter, doctors predicted he wouldn't see another 2 years. Still, the sentence was symbolic, a line drawn through decades of silence. Afterward, Mira Ellison stood at the edge of the courthouse steps watching the reporters swarm. She wasn't interested in the interviews. Her part was done. And yet one final question remained. What had really happened in that sealed room beneath the tunnel of whispers? Had Frankie died there? Had he been moved? Had someone else, perhaps Arliss or another unknown accomplice, delivered the final blow? Madsen refused to say. All stories need a little mystery, he murmured before closing his eyes. The state ordered the room beneath the park to be filled with concrete. A memorial plaque was placed on the site bearing the names of known victims and one simple line at the bottom. For those who vanished in silence, your story is now heard. A year later, a historian at the Ohio Historical Society found another photograph, this one in a donation box of old family albums. It showed a group of children at the fun park in 1958. In the background, barely visible, was a man in a brown cap. He was watching then too. Fairhaven moved on slowly. The carousel was rebuilt by local artisans and placed in the town square, this time under glass and guarded by security at night. Children rode it again. Laughter returned. But at the base of the black horse, an inscription was etched into the brass plate. Frankie Harrow, 1952-1959, still riding. As for Mira, she retired again, this time for good. She moved to a quiet cottage near Sandusky and took up painting. Mostly landscapes, sometimes carousels. On certain evenings, she lit a candle in her window. Not because she believed the dead needed light, but because justice, even when delayed, deserves to shine. Frankie Harrow's story is more than a tale of disappearance. It's a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can rise when someone refuses to stop searching. Justice may come late, but it's always worth pursuing. And sometimes all it takes is one person to believe a lost voice deserves to be heard for darkness to finally lose its grip.